Welcome to BNEWS Special Report. I'm Phil Gallagher along with my guest Dan Kennedy. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Phil.
Dan has been a frequent guest here at BNEWS and at the old Topics program for the past 30 years, been on a number of times, on a number of different subjects. So over that 30 years, we've had the pleasure of watching your career, which you're in the media, and your career has taken off, where the print media certainly has declined. Let's do just a brief resume here, curriculum vitae, as it would be.
Okay.
Dan is an associate professor in journalism at Northeastern. He's a graduate of Northeastern with an undergraduate degree in journalism and a master's in history from BU. He's a panelist on WGBH's Beat the Press, if you see that on Sunday mornings. He's a blogger at Media Nation and Wired City. That's correct, okay. He's a former media writer at The Guardian and the Boston Phoenix, and he was a cub reporter for the Daily Times Chronicle from '79 to 1988.
Not so much of a cub by the time I left, but
by
yes.
the time you left. He's the author of 3 books, Little People, Learning to See the World Through My Daughter's Eyes, Wired City, and his latest, which is Return of the Moguls, How Jeff Bezos and John Henry Are Remaking Newspapers for the 21st Century. So the origin of the book came from the Shorenstein Fellowship. Tell us
Yes.
about that. Tell us how you arrived at that title, that subject matter.
Okay, well, I had actually been working on the book before the Shorenstein Fellowship, although that gave me what I needed to really move ahead with it in a serious way. The book actually came together in one weekend in August of 2013. I had been casting about for a new project. I'd been talking with an editor at University Press of New England. And on a Friday, we learned that John Henry of the Red Sox was going to buy the Boston Globe. We had barely begun to digest that news when we found out the following Monday that Jeff Bezos of Amazon would buy the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
So this was, pretty big. Mm-hmm. But every journalist knows you need 3 to make a trend story. And at the same time, a young man named Aaron Kushner, a wealthy entrepreneur, had been getting a lot of attention for the way he was remaking the Orange County Register in Southern California. Mm-hmm. And he was somebody who had also tried to buy the Boston Globe earlier. So we said, here are 3 people that are worth following. Let's see what they do. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Shorenstein Fellowship. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that in the spring of 2016. And at that point, I wrote what essentially became the Washington Post part of the book.
Mm-hmm. So the Shorenstein Fellowship, a fellowship basically pays you to do scholarship work.
Yes.
So you were able to.
You can't beat it, man, I'll tell you.
You can't beat that. So let's go back a little globe history. I mean, Ox and Salzburger, the New York Times had bought it. I think paid, well, give us some history. They paid $1-something billion for it.
Oh, the New York Times Company bought the Boston Globe in 1993 for, as you say, $1.1 billion, which at the time was half the stock market valuation of the entire New York Times Company. And by the time John Henry bought it, it was all the way down to $70 million. And actually, the value of the property that the Globe was located on was greater than the value of the paper. John Henry just recently sold the property for more than $80 million.
More than he bought the Globe for.
Yeah.
Now, there was another interim thing that happened in there, and that Jack Welch of GE fame had made a play for the Globe also several years prior at a much larger number, somewhere in the order of 500 million, didn't he?
Yes, I think around 2005, 2006, Jack Welch and put together a group that was willing to pay quite a bit more than the Times Company ultimately sold it for. I think that by the time when Jack Welch came along, the Times Company had actually made a lot of money running the Globe. The Globe was a revenue machine for a long time. And I think that at the point Welch came forward, the Times Company, like newspaper executives everywhere, really had no idea what was about to hit them in the face.
Right. But wasn't it apparent at that point? Wasn't in Wired City, I mean, wasn't it apparent that that print advertising was migrating dramatically over into the new media?
It wasn't as apparent as it later became. I think for a long time, newspaper owners really believed that they were all going to do very well by giving away their journalism online and supporting it with digital advertising. They really didn't have a sense that digital advertising wasn't going to work out. And essentially 3 things happened to destroy the value of digital advertising. One is that classified ads became free thanks to Craigslist.
Right.
And
Sure.
that was a huge part of every
Right.
newspaper's business model, 40% of their revenues. So there went all of their classified ad revenue, essentially. The rest of the ads, the display ads, department stores, banks, things like that, really failed to make a successful transition to digital. You think of the banner ads that you find on any website. I would argue that no one has ever clicked on a banner ad except by mistake.
Right. Well, and now when you click on a banner ad, it's got actors and voices and talking and all the reasons why you should buy some product, whereas a banner ad in the newspaper is, you know, red on black print.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I'll have to take your word for it. I don't click on banner ads. And then the final blow that came along is that Facebook and Google ended up scooping up virtually all of the digital ad revenue. More than 90% of new spending on digital advertising goes to Google and Facebook. So that really left newspapers with virtually nothing online, which is why you're starting to see a big push by the Boston Globe and just about every other newspaper to get their readers to pay for digital, whereas not that many years ago, they were still embracing the free model.
Well, how was the firewall worked out? Firewall meaning, I think Wall Street Journal has one, Washington Post has it,
Yes.
the Boston Globe has it, but how is firewalls working out in terms of paying for a subscription?
Yeah, well, it's worked out well for the Wall Street Journal for a long time because it was long thought, you know, rightly so, that financial news, you know, good, high quality financial
Specialty news.
was
Sure.
one of the few things that you could charge for.
Right.
The idea of charging for more general news is newer, and you know, it's working fairly well in some places. The New York Times has more than 3 million digital-only subscribers at this point. The Washington Post has more than 1 million. Now, it's harder for the regional papers. The Globe has actually been as successful as anybody. They are on track. They should soon pass the 100,000 mark for digital-only subscribers.
This is a tiny market, comparatively speaking, to the rest of the
They
rest
can
of the
only
players.
draw on the Boston area, really, eastern Massachusetts. And
Which totals what, about 1,200,000, 1,400,000?
oh, I think it's more than that.
Is it
It's,
now
it's about 3
Boston's-
million, I think.
Well,
Eastern
Massachusetts is 6 million, right? So yeah, I guess Eastern
Yeah.
Massachusetts would be
Nobody
3.
lives out
Nobody lives out there. yeah,
out
yeah.
past 495.
Well, look, you go 50 miles from any city in the country and you're
That's
in the same
right.
place.
That's right. But the other half of the John Henry formula for charging for digital is to charge a lot. I mean, the Globe charges $30 a month for a digital-only subscription once the initial discounts have worn off. No one else is charging that much, and yet they've had some success with it.
Right.
And they will say that if they can get to 200,000, the Globe starts to look like a sustainable business.
Right. Now, this isn't the first time that there's been a Red Sox Globe connection. Taylor, way back, explain that to us. And
This
then
is the third time.
Third time, and then explain to us how Henry manages to manage that conflict of a newspaper covering his
Yeah.
prime holding. Well, it's not his prime holding, but his prime public holding would be the Red Sox.
Well, the Taylor family owned the Globe from the second year of its existence right up until 1993.
General
And
Taylor, or is he second generation?
General Taylor was the original Taylor.
He was.
He
yeah.
was Colonel Taylor, then he was General Taylor. I believe that
Battlefield promotion.
his battlefield promotion came from serving in some sort of a political capacity. But the Taylor family owned the Globe in the teens, as I recall. I'm trying to remember. I haven't read my book for a while. And it was actually bought as kind of a plaything for one of the Taylor kids who didn't want to have anything to do with the newspaper. And the timing was, it couldn't have been worse. They owned it for like a 10 or 12 year period during which the Red Sox never won anything. But they did improve Fenway Park quite a bit during those years. Of course, as I think we know, Tom Yawkey improved it quite a bit more, and then John Henry improved it. But
not that you can improve a 100 and whatever year old.
no, exactly. So the Taylors are the people who sold it to the infamous Harry Frazee, who sold Babe Ruth.
Right.
In the 1990s, when the New York Times Company owned the Globe, the Times Company was a minority investor in New England Sports Network. And so through that, we're actually part owners of the Red Sox. So the Globe already was in this position where they had to disclose certain conflicts depending on the type of coverage. But then when John Henry bought the Globe, now you have the principal owner of the Red Sox also being the sole owner of the Globe. And that's been an interesting problem for them to navigate.
And how would you critique that success or failure at this point?
I think they've essentially done fine with it. Certainly Dan Shaughnessy, who writes a very caustic column, has not been interfered with in any way. What they do, and I think they've been pretty good about this, is if they are reporting on the Globe as a business enterprise or as a cultural institution, as a company that wants to, close a street around Fenway or something, they always disclose the ownership. But when they're reporting on the Red Sox as a baseball team, they don't bother. And I think they've done okay. I mean, let's face it, Amazon does business with the CIA. I mean, that is a much more difficult relationship for the Washington Post to navigate than anything the Globe has to deal with.
Well, let's get on to Bezos, but let's ask the general question. Are these vanity buys for both of them, for Henry and for Bezos, owning the flagship in Boston, owning the flagship in Washington?
I think that there's a lot of motivations that you could look to here. Is it an ego buy? Yeah, absolutely. You say vanity buy. I prefer to think of it as an ego buy because I think what a lot of these very wealthy newspaper owners believe going in is that there's nothing wrong with the newspaper business that couldn't be fixed by me applying
my principles, my business acumen.
Exactly, exactly. And
well, that's certainly in Henry's case what fixed the Red Sox.
Right. Yes, it did. But so far, it hasn't fixed the Globe.
Right.
It's a much more difficult problem. As it turns out, winning a World Series is easier than fixing a major metropolitan newspaper. Now, Jeff Bezos, frankly, nothing has happened with the Post that would diminish his ego at all. He has built what they claim to be a profitable business in fairly short order.
Right. Well, let's ask this question. You say he does business with the CIA. Is this a defensive buy by Bezos, who most certainly is going to face some sort of antitrust legislation in the not too distant future? I mean, the amount of dominance, as you say, that Google and Facebook have in the ad business, he's almost achieved that in the retail business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really good question. And I think that when Bezos bought the Washington Post, there was a lot of apprehension because people assumed that he would use the Post for his ends, at least to some extent. So far, he's really been a model owner. He's completely left the newsroom alone, as John Henry has with the Globe. Bezos has completely left the editorial pages alone.
Well, now who's there? Marty Barron? Is Marty Barron?
Well,
the,
Marty Barron's the editor,
Right.
probably the best newspaper editor in the country. Fred Hyatt is the editorial page editor, and Bezos inherited him and has left him in place. By contrast, John and Linda Henry have made their influence felt on the editorial pages of the Globe.
Well, she actually has a position at the paper, doesn't she?
She's managing director of the Globe.
Right.
Not inappropriate for an owner to do, as long as they stay out of the news coverage.
Right.
But Bezos hasn't even done that. Bezos has taken a great interest in Washington Post technology, as you would expect. And frankly, it's the Post's technological edge, which they had actually been developing before Bezos got there, but has accelerated since he got there, that I think has really helped make them a formidable competitor to the New York Times in a way that they hadn't been since the Watergate era.
Well, let's look at it from the employment perspective. What was at the peak of the newsroom and at the Post? Was it 950?
Oh, they had over 1,000 at
Over
one
1,000.
time. When Bezos bought the Post from the
Now, these are beat guys, right? Beat people?
well, they're everything.
Everything.
Editors, reporters, photographers, graphic designers, you name it.
Right.
It was more than 1,000 people. That had shrunk down to 560 when Bezos bought the Post. And in fairly short order, he brought that number up to around 700. Today, it's probably closer to 800. Now, this is why I say he's operating it as a real business and not just as a plaything. The New York Times still has about 12 or 1,300 people in its newsroom. Now, when you think about the money that Jeff Bezos has at his disposal, wealthiest person in the world the last I checked, he could just say, well, the Times has 1,200, I'll have 1,500.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, he's been disciplined about it. He wants to operate it as a real business because if he can make it a real, sustainable, profitable business, that's a real accomplishment that the rest of the newspaper business will look to.
Now, there was a turning point for the Grahams and the Washington Post back a number of years ago. Graham was in negotiation with Zuckerberg for the purchase of 10% of the of Facebook. What was it called at that time? The Facebook.
The Facebook.
The
yes.
Facebook. All right. So he's in negotiation. Tell us that story.
Well, Don Graham was actually a pretty forward-thinking person when it came to technology. People think, oh, they really needed Jeff Bezos to move ahead on technology. But Don Graham got it. And he saw an early version of the Facebook. He said it actually reminded him of something that they did in print at Harvard. And he said, this is going to be very popular. And he became friendly with Mark Zuckerberg. You can imagine Zuckerberg wasn't even old enough to drink at the time.
Right? Yeah, right.
And Don Graham was, I guess, in his 50s at that time.
And a major player in the national scene.
And
certainly.
a major player in the national scene. And Zuckerberg wanted to take Facebook public, and Graham offered to buy 10% of the company. And they had a handshake deal to do it.
$10 million.
$10
million, I think. Yeah.
I don't remember the
I
numbers.
just read your book, so
I haven't read it for a while. But what went wrong was that one of Zuckerberg's business partners went out and found a better deal. Another company was willing to pay more money for a smaller share of the company, and Zuckerberg really, really wanted to take that better deal. And Don Graham had a reputation of being a real gentleman, almost to a fault. He believed that they had a handshake deal, but he let Zuckerberg walk away from it. And when you think of the way that the value of Facebook has increased over the years, Don Graham could have been his own Jeff Bezos.
Right,
in
he
terms
could have
of-
billionaire, but let's speculate more on the side of journalism. What would have been, speculate for us on the type of impact that it might have on journalism had there been a journalism entity like the Washington Post intertwined with something as big as Facebook? in
Well,
terms
it could have been a very different kind of company, but maybe not. I mean, Graham would have been a minority investor. He has remained friendly with Zuckerberg and has advised him anyway. But Zuckerberg has taken Facebook in the direction that he thought would be the most profitable. Zuckerberg has several times embraced news as a way to build Facebook, retreated from news, thinking that, actually family and friends is more the way to go. I mean, he keeps going back and forth.
But if the Washington Post had been inculcated in Facebook,
that's true. But Graham had Zuckerberg's ear anyway. I'm not sure that it would have made that much difference.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about. You had a talk at the Rockport Library, and journalism in the age of fake news and truth telling was your topic.
Yes.
How long was that talk? That you could have gone on for quite.
We
a
could have,
period
and
of
it
time.
was a huge panel, so everybody got to speak for about 2 minutes.
Oh, really? Too bad. Too bad. Well, you had another one then. Let's talk about. You were the keynote speaker at the American Association of Newspaper Distributors, so I presume that you had everybody's full attention for that one.
That was a fascinating talk. I love doing that. That basically you're talking about these older print guys. These are guys who are still involved in the print side of newspapers. And the fact is, even after all these years, by the way, don't come to me for predictions. 10 years ago, I would have said the print newspapers would be gone by now and they'd be all digital. In fact, newspapers still make most of their money from their print editions. That's why they're still here.
Yeah, right.
The Washington Post still makes most of its money from its print edition, even though for most of the country it exists now as a digital-only product. These are great people. They know what's coming, but at the same time they're saying, we're still driving most of the revenue for you, so we're still important. And I really enjoyed talking with them.
What about the impact of all of this on the local level? I mean, were you with the Times? I mean, we did Editors Roundtable for a period of time.
Yep.
There's John and Freddie and Liz Banks. Each of you, I think, each of those papers had at least 3 or 4 stringers covering
Yes.
your area. How does the vacuum get filled at the local area?
That's become a serious challenge. In fact, I have my next column for WGBH News will deal with some new studies involving what's happened to news at the local level.
Right.
You have a variety of different problems going on. One of them, quite frankly, is that most very local papers, weeklies, small dailies, have been scooped up by gigantic chains controlled by
Gatehouse,
hedge
et cetera.
funds, Gatehouse, Digital First, the ironically named Digital First. They have never been digital first. And I could tell you how they got that name, but it's probably not that interesting. And so that's a problem. They are trying to squeeze what last little bit of profit remains in those papers, and so the journalistic product is diminished as a result. But you also still have some great family-owned papers, like the Daily Times Chronicle, still owned by the Haggerty family, and they're dealing with some of the same pressures that everybody else is. Advertising has diminished. They've lost their classifieds to Craigslist. They've lost some of their other advertising to Facebook. So it's a very difficult road for any newspaper owner today. And making up that journalism, which is just so important for meeting the needs that people have to be informed in a democracy, is increasingly a major challenge.
Well, let's look at the employment side just briefly, and your clientele at the university that are coming in. Do you see diminished numbers of people who are dedicating themselves to journalism because a reduced amount of revenue available for employment there?
Are you talking about students?
Students, yeah.
Oh, well, every journalism program is different. And one of the ways that we have always tried to explain our journalism program is that it's a great major for many different types of jobs. Probably the majority of our students go into different types of public relations and corporate communications jobs.
Even advertising, certainly.
Even advertising. And, that's always been the case.
Right.
That's always been the case. We do have a dedicated minority of students who want to go into journalism, and they find a way to do it. Some of them are at traditional newspaper jobs. We've got people at the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Right.
We have people working at Politico and BuzzFeed and places like that. So
most important, anybody at Breitbart or any of those, any of the right-wing sides? I know you got the left wing covered. How about the right wing?
It's interesting. Not Breitbart, but the Daily Caller.
Oh yeah, Tucker Carlson.
Yes, they every so often they get in touch with me. They're looking for interns, and we try to make it known to our students. Hey, if any of you are interested in working for a conservative website, here's a chance for you to do that. But I'm not certain that we've been successful in placing anybody there.
So I presume you have a strong minor in English, which is always valuable to any student, right?
We tend not to find our students minoring in English.
Really?
They learn to write with us. But a lot of them, they're double majoring in journalism and history or journalism and political science.
Right.
They take a minor in something else. They're great students.
Better be strong in English if you're going to be in that business anyway.
They do need to be strong with the English language, and what we try to emphasize to them is, no, you are probably not going to work for a newspaper. Yes, you still need to learn how to write.
Right, exactly. Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Let's talk about, you're a media critic as well. That's part of your thing.
Yes.
Tell us how the journalism and the press got the presidential elections so wrong and are so unwilling to fully analyze why they get it wrong.
Well, I think it's actually an incredibly simple story. We believe the polls, and there was a failure of polling. Nate Silver of 538, one of the real
preeminent
polling analysts. He doesn't poll.
Right,
he analyzes polls. He's
also batting averages too.
Right. Yes. He got his start in an honest business, analyzing baseball. He's explained it very well, and he said that the national polls were actually quite good. Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump in the national vote within the margin of error of what the national polls were showing. The state polls were a mess, and part of it was because of the business crisis facing the news business. They were not funding some of the state polls to the extent that they had been, and some of them were in some fairly crucial states. But I would argue that I think that by defining media failure as getting it wrong, I think that I have seen a lot of that. I agree with you. I think that we need to think about what our job really is. And I don't think that predicting the outcome of elections is really what we ought to be primarily in the business of. We should be out reporting what's going on, helping people understand who these candidates are, and not be in the business of, oh, this one's going to win, oh, that one's going to win.
Well, wasn't it a lot of wishful thinking, too? I recall, election night. Look, I'm an amateur. I've been an amateur all these years.
Yeah.
And I must have won 8 or 9 bets that Trump would win the election.
Yeah.
Yet there was nobody in journalism on the TV that was saying, this guy's going to win the election, with the exception, I think, of Ann Coulter, of all people.
Right.
And I think Jim Hoft of Gateway Pundit was another one.
I go by the data, and I think journalists go by the data. When you say that you predicted Trump, well, good for you. You were right.
I had a 50-50 chance.
You weren't going by, but you weren't going by the data.
No.
I think that most of us were looking at the data, and I mean, some of these polling models are extremely sophisticated. The New York Times had a very good polling model. And going into the last few days, they showed Hillary Clinton with a 95% chance of winning.
Right, at 8 o'clock in the morning, 95% chance.
That's right.
By 8 o'clock at night, it was a
That's
95% chance of losing.
By the way, Nate Silver, who's better at this than most people, he was much more reserved. I think
Yes.
he said that
Yeah.
she had a 65 or 75% chance of winning.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Dan Kennedy, Associate Professor of Journalism at Northeastern University and the author of several books, including
The Return of the Moguls,
Return of the
how
Moguls.
Jeff Bezos and John Henry are remaking newspapers for the 21st century.
also Wired City, also a panelist on Beat the Press, and a longtime guest here on BNEWS, as well as Topics in the Old Days. We look forward to having him join us back again to review current events in journalism. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Phil.
Have a good evening.